Hi, this is Chris Savage from IRL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of James. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to this session 7, chapter 4, verse 13 to chapter 5, 11. Just a quick recap from last session. Faith is tested by its relationship to the world and worldliness. Evidence of worldliness we saw in amongst these Jewish believers was there was hostility amongst the believers because, and also in today, hostility among us as well today because of a desire to please ourselves. And this comes out of the sin nature that it is within us. We saw that there was a downward progression of worldliness. It was shown through lust. And when you can't get what you want, you kill in a figurative sense. That is, you take violent actions. You covet. You become jealous for what someone else has, and when you can't get it, you fight and you war. So you go to some extremes to satisfy your evil desires. We saw that there are two reasons for failure. First of all, you don't have because you don't ask. You fail to ask God. And when you do finally ask, you ask through wrong motivation and you fail to get what you want because you ask for things to satisfy your own pleasures, to spend on yourselves. And you also fail to meet criteria set by God, which is for answered prayer, which is you need to ask in faith, not doubting, first thing. And also you need to ask according to his will. He gives us the criteria in his word. We see also that friendship with the world is enmity with God. Now, remember, we're talking about the world system here. It's the world system that is hostile against God. It's not people in the world, it's actually the world system. And so what we see is that believers cannot be loyal to both God and the world system. We can't have two masters. If you want to have friendship with this world system, you are now set in battle array, if you like, against God. And James calls us, or he calls these Jewish believers adulteresses because that's what they were in friendship with the world system. And this is spiritual adultery, because remember that we have been betrothed to Christ. We belong to Christ. And God is unwilling to share man's affection with the world. The Holy Spirit, which was given us at conversion, yearns enviously for our total devotion and loyalty. What are our obligations in light of this? Well, we need to appropriate grace from the throne of grace. We need to be subject unto God, which is, we need to recognize our proper position or a proper station under God. We need to resist the devil. It says, resist the devil, he'll flee. We need to draw near to God in fellowship. We need to also be repentant of sin when we realize we've sinned. And you know what else? We need to really humble ourselves and submit to his commands. That's the believer's obligations in light of friendship with the world system. We need to come under his authority totally. Now, we saw some violations of the royal law. Remember, the royal law was to love your neighbor as yourself. And one of the things we saw, which was happening amongst these believers, was that they're running each other down. They were demeaning one another in front of others in order simply to elevate themselves. And this was a habitual practice amongst them. And this violates the royal law. Another thing that they were guilty of doing was judging a brother. So they then moved from running somebody down by talking to now condemning a brother. And again, this is against the royal law because the person now places himself above the law as a judge, right? But remember, God is both the lawgiver and judge. He's the only lawgiver and he's the only ultimate judge. He's the one who puts the law in its place, and then he enforces his will, and he punishes those who disobey. And where we are, we're coming up now to, we're looking into a warning in light of this judgment. And this is in chapter 4, verse 13 to chapter 5, verse 6. Now, there are two segments in this section, And both of them we're going to see, come now. James is going to say, come now. Now listen up, fellas. That's what he's going to say. And then he's going to give a warning. Come now, you that say today or tomorrow we will go into this city and spend a year there and trade and get gain. Whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. What is your life? For you are a vapor that appear for a little time, then vanish away. For that you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall both live and do this or that. But now you glory in your vauntings. All such glorying is evil. To him, therefore, that knows to do good and does it not, to him it is sin. So James addresses his first warning here to Jewish believers. Remember, he's writing to the Jewish believers. And these are materialistically focused, believing merchants in his congregation who arrogantly mapped out their destinations and travels on the basis of, how much profit they're going to make, and except that they hadn't, there's no reference to the will of God at all. According to verse 13, in chapter 4, verse 13, their specific sin is planning without God in violation of Proverbs 27:1. Proverbs 27:1 says, boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth. We don't know what tomorrow brings forth. In the Greek text, we see here the expression come now. Again, this is emphasizing a sense of urgency. And it's only here and we're going to see in chapter 5, verse 1, only the two places in the New Testament. Then James writes, you that say, and he's writing here in the present tense, which means that this is a continual, habitual action on their part as they plan. Today or tomorrow, we will go into this city and spend a year there and trade and get some gain. So their intentions are fully developed, right down to the last minute detail. And these guys are speaking a language which is reflecting their self-assurance and self-confidence in, this, we're going to do this and this and this and this. This is all we're going to do, and we're going to make this much money. However, these assumptions picture the future as entirely under their own control, which makes them guilty of the sin of presumption. It's not under their control. The expression today or tomorrow explains that occasionally a planned activity begins today or it starts tomorrow. And the expression we'll go into this city is the first stage of their predetermined plan to go to a predetermined city. Now, apparently, the whole year is at their disposal to then spend a year there. This is our plan. This is what we're gonna do for certainty. And the expression "and trade" really means to travel for trade. So it means that they're gonna travel there to gain their goal. So the sin is making plans without God. And in verse 14, James explains two reasons these actions are considered a sin. And the first reason is, whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. You don't know what your tomorrows hold. We cannot be sure what tomorrow will bring. And he says they know not, which means they have having no sure and accurate knowledge of tomorrow. These believers we see were not living by faith, which would if they were living by faith, it would actually give them a very calm against any insecurities that tomorrow might bring. Again, this violates Proverbs 27:1. Boast not yourself of tomorrow, because you just simply don't know what a day may bring forth. And then James now states the second reason these believers should not have this sin in their lives. He says, what is your life? For you are a vapor that appear for a time and then vanish away. His point here is that life is transitory and life can very quickly end. So what is your life, he's saying? Life is not uncertain to God, but it is uncertain to us. Only when we are in his will can we be confident of tomorrow, for we know that he is leading us. So these businessmen have no way of knowing if they'll be alive tomorrow, because he says, you are a vapor. What's he saying here? All he's saying is, it just refers to a breath just appearing in the cold air for a split second, but then disappearing. And yet they've made plans for the next year. For a little time, which is a vapor, it just means it's visible for a short time, and then it vanishes away, it disappears from sight. In the Greek text here, there's a word play that can best be illustrated by translating the phrase as it appears and disappears. So how foolish is it to ignore God when life is nothing more than a vapor? It's so transitory. Here today, gone tomorrow. Now, there's a rabbinic parallel which we find in the Mishnah Rabbah 9:1. It says, Rabbi Simeon ben Halafta, who trusted in his own moral strength, left at midnight to return to his city. On the road, the angel of death met him, and Rabbi Simeon noticed he was looking strange. He asked him, who are you? And the latter answered, I'm God's messenger. He asked him, why are you looking strange? He replied, on account of the talk of human beings who say, this and this we will do, and yet not one of them knows when he'll be summoned to die. Not one of us do know that. The obligation we find in verse 15. And this models what these businessmen should be thinking and declaring. For that you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall both live and do this and do that. For that you ought to say literally reads, instead of your saying. In other words, this is the opposite of their heart and speech, which we found in verses 13 to 14. More appropriately, their speech should be, if the Lord will. If it is God's will, this is what we can do. They need to seek the will of the Lord, which they have not been doing. That's why it is sin. They need to be sensitive to change of plans if God so wills. And this expression is not found in the Old Testament, but it is a very common term in the New Testament, which we see it in Acts. If the Lord wills, we see them using it in Acts 18:21 and also 1 Corinthians 4:19 and 16:7, along with the writer of Hebrews uses it in Hebrews 6:3. So now this admonition is especially true in light of the future AD 70 judgment, when internally inside the land, the Jewish economy will collapse, while externally outside the land, the Jewish itinerants would be economically affected. So, this is not long away from this time here. Rather, they should declare, if the Lord will, we shall both live and do this or that, because both their lives and our lives and deeds are dependent upon God's will. Their lives and activities must be committed to God's grace. It's not, it's not wrong to make future plans, but in making them, the believer needs to be sensitive to the will of the Lord and be willing to change them if God so wills. Yeah, how easy it is as our life settles down from the initial flush of meeting with the Lord to now become self-made, self-assured believers who, even though we're Christians, live as if this world is all that there is. And many times now we hear people that when they pray, we pray in reference to our lives. It's not to ask God where and what we should do, but to ask his blessing on our plans. That is sin. In verse 16, James explains the results of this insensitivity in following God's future plans. This failure here results in committing the sin of self-glory. But now you glory in your vauntings. The expression "but now" refers to this past sin in contrast to more appropriate future speech, where he says, "you glory," and "you glory" demonstrates this presumptuous boasting because, we are masters of our destiny. We have set forth the plans, and their vauntings here refers to their pretentious braggings. And the fact is, all such glorying is evil. There is a glorying which is good, but this type of glorying is evil. Why? Because this glorying displays an arrogance of spirit. Now, in verse 17, James now states that these believers already know this truth, and therefore their speech is sinful. To him, therefore, that knows to do good, which is them, and does it not, to him it is sin. So the word "therefore," again, it emphasizes the reason why the boasting of verse 16 is wrong, in that they know to do the good, and yet they don't do it. Knowing but not doing means these believers, remember, are not doers of the word. We need to be not only knowers of the word, but we need to be doers of the word. And for those guilty of this, to them it is sin. And sin is in the emphatic position here, and the Greek literally reads, "sin to him it is." The sin being in the emphatic position. Again, as Jewish believers, they should be aware of decisions formulated in conscious dependence on God's will. However, in boasting about their future activities and proud self-sufficiency, they're not practicing the good. In fact, they're practicing the evil. So this shows us here that sin is not only a wrong act, but it can also be a right act that is not performed. Now we have a warning to Jewish unbelievers here in verses 1 to 6 of chapter 5. Come now, in verse 1, we see the call to the rich here. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. So in verse 1 here, we have this call. These are the rich men outside of the congregation, outside the church. These are unbelievers. And these are the rich Pharisees and Sadducees who oppressed the Jewish believers back in chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. They took advantage of them. And to them he says, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. And the word weep here means to sob bitterly. It's actually used in the Gospels, in Luke chapter 7, verse 13 and 32, and John 11, 31 to 32, as those who are wailing for the dead. That's the type of weeping we're hearing here, to sob bitterly. And the Greek word for howl is an expression of intense grief. So these are howls of agony. And in the Greek New Testament, it is used only here and nowhere else. Now, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it refers to expressions of violent grief. In fact, the word ololizo, which is a Greek word wail, it's found only in the prophets in the Old Testament and always in the context of judgment. So they're howling because of judgment. They're to weep and howl because the AD 70 judgment is coming soon. It will destroy their wealth. They're to weep and howl for your miseries. The word miseries here is a Greek word used only here, and we find it again in Romans chapter 3, verse 16. And it refers to that the resultant feelings of wretchedness and distress. These miseries are coming upon you. And the way it's written in the Greek, it says, the judgment is already approaching and it's about to strike. So it's near. This judgment is near. It'll strike upon you. It'll personally fall upon these rich unbelievers. Your riches, and he goes on to say, your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten. So this is in verses 2 to 3. We're going to see the author describes the approaching destruction of the Pharisees and the Sadducees' riches. And these verbs are all used and are all in the Greek perfect tense. So this may function either as what they call a Hebrew prophetic perfect, in which a future event is looked upon as a past act, or it might refer to the abiding condition of their wealth, as will be revealed in the day of judgment. So their riches here are corrupted, and the word means rotted, it's wasted away. And this is a reference, the word is used as a reference to accumulated foodstuffs, which are simply rotted away. And he says, your garments are moth-eaten. Now, garments in the Greek here refers to the long outer robes, which are wonderfully embroidered as a sign of wealth. We saw that back early in chapter 1, chapter 2. So this expensive clothing will become moth-eaten and valueless, useless. Now, although the rich do not or cannot see it, their great wealth has already lost its luster. It can provide no foundation for the life to come. As they say, you can't take it with you. Third, he says in verse 3, your gold and your silver are rusted. And the Greek word which appears only in this verse means is covered with rust. It's to be thoroughly or completely rusted. Now, we do know that gold and silver do not rust, but James would have known this also. Gold can be corroded and silver can be tarnished. So this is simply James's way of saying that the gold and silver will become worthless for them in the day of judgment. In that day of judgment, their rust shall be a testimony against them. So how did this rust accumulate? Well, it accumulated through non-use. It just sat there being accumulated. And this is going to function against them as an adversarial witness, exhibiting their failure to use monetary gain for the benefit of others. It was all for them. So this rust is a visible sign of non-use. Now, gold and silver were not used to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, or to aid a neighbor. Instead, it was being hoarded. So there was no love of neighbor being demonstrated here. And remember, if we're talking of the Pharisees and Sadducees, they knew about that Leviticus 19 command to love your neighbor. And he states, their rust shall eat your flesh as fire. So the point here is that the rust will consume the hoarders. Shall eat is in the future tense, and again is pointing to the near coming judgment of AD 70. And the expression your flesh, this is the recipient of the hoarded gold and silver. This is just going to become fuel for the fire. And again, this is the fire of the AD 70 judgment. So they're hoarding their wealth for that fire. Like fire, and that's the AD 70. The rust will punish the selfish possessor. It shall eat your flesh as fire. Why? Because you've laid up your treasures for the last days, when it will be lost. Again, it's a reference to the coming AD 70 judgment, and it re-emphasizes the foolishness of hoarding in light of impending doom. Hoarding only gives more fuel for the fire that will consume them, for they did not realize they were living in the last days before the judgment of AD 70. Now, the Bible does not discourage saving and providing for one's needs, but it is against the accumulation of self-directed wealth focused solely on one's own comforts and pleasures. Jesus was very clear about this when he said, do not store up for yourselves the treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But he says, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We find that in Matthew 6, verses 19 to 21. So this wealth should be used for the benefit of others. And they continued in violation of the teachings of Jesus. Here we see what I've just said in Matthew 6, 19 to 21. In verses 4 to 6, James now describes the conduct of the rich, and he notes their guilt in 3 specific areas. First of all, in verse 4, these profiteers are guilty of injustice, as seen in the defrauding of their laborers in the fields. Behold, the hire of laborers who mowed your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud. Again, we see behold, so it's a call for special attention here. And the special attention here is to the hire of the laborers. So this is a reference here to the day laborer whose daily pay was being withheld on some technicality. Yet this worker's meals were dependent upon this daily pay. So these agricultural employees, these farm laborers, they mowed the fields of the rich and ingathered their fields. And because these farm workers' daily material needs were dependent upon their daily earnings, withholding these daily wages was specifically forbidden by the law of Moses in Leviticus 19:13 and Deuteronomy 24:14 to 15. And the prophets also, Jeremiah 22:13 and Malachi 3 verse 5. Leviticus 19:13 says, do not defraud your neighbor or rob him. Do not hold back the wages of a hired man overnight. Yet, in spite of these prohibitions by the law and the prophets, the wages here are being kept back by fraud. And the Greek word for fraud appears only here. And it means to be withheld by some legal technicality. So the author directly charges the rich with this crime. And as a result, the wages itself cries out. In the Greek present tense, it cry out means loud cries or screams. It's a continual ongoing action because this money is wrongfully withheld. This capital itself begins crying out for vengeance. It's like the blood of Abel from the ground, and we see back in Genesis 4:10, it cries out for vengeance. And the cries of them that reaped have entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. So not only does the money cry out to be delivered to its rightful owners, the victims also cry out. And the Greek word for cry here, referring to the workers, is different than the one used of the money which cries out. The previous one was a loud cry or shout. But in the Septuagint and in this verse, it's here used now as a cry to God by the oppressed. So this twofold cry does not go unheard, for it reaches the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth, who hears. It also reminds the rich who think the poor have no protector. The Lord of the whole hosts in heaven and earth is a guardian and avenger of the poor. The oppressed are them that did the reaping. They that reaped. They've completed the work, but no joy is derived from the labor because there's no pay. At the end of the day, they've robbed us of our wages. This was a terrible crime because the poverty-stricken workers were living hand to mouth. And a day without wages was a day without food. And the owners were doing this at harvest time when their barns were full and there was no lack. And here we see God is called Lord of Sabaoth. While a common title for God in the Old Testament, this is the only place it's actually used in the New Testament. Only James uses it here. And this word Sabaoth is a Hebrew word meaning hosts. So the Lord of hosts, again, using this term here, it reveals that it's a Jewish author addressing Jewish readers because they would understand. The expression is also found in Romans 9:29, although Paul himself doesn't actually use it. He simply quotes from Isaiah 1 verse 9. So James is the only one who uses this term in the New Testament. And in verse 5, it says, you have lived delicately on the earth and taken your pleasure. You have nourished your hearts in a day of slaughter. So the second sin these rich committers is in this verse 5. They're living a life of luxury at the expense of the poor. And so the author uses these three aorist indicatives here, and he's providing here a summary of sins which demand a judgment. So he says, first up, he says, you have lived delicately on the earth, and their self-indulgences will nourish them for a day of slaughter, for the AD 70 judgment. So these people these rich folk have lived a soft, pampered life, a daily life of soft luxury, in their fine robes, finely embroidered robes, rings on their fingers. The Greek here for soft luxury, it's only used here in this verse, and it refers to a life of luxury and self-indulgence. So living this way on the earth shows that they're concerned only with the now and not with the hereafter. They're living for today. On earth also suggests a bit of a contrast between the pleasures the rich have enjoyed in this world and the torment that awaits them in the hereafter. Cast your mind back to Luke, in Luke 16 verse 25, where we have a similar contrast in Abraham's words to the rich man and Lazarus in Jesus's parable. Abraham says to the rich man who's in torment, he says, son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things, but now he's comforted here and you are in agony over there. Second, they've taken your pleasure, which adds the concept of wastefulness to their self-indulgence. Third, you have nourished your hearts in a day of slaughter. And the Greek word for nourish means to fatten. They've fattened it up. And now the Greek word for hearts refers to their inner desires. That's what it is. So they've fattened up their inner desires for the day of slaughter. So the rich here they're portrayed as enjoying a continual feast, bloating their own hearts with the delights and enjoyments which were theirs in abundance. They lacked nothing. Life was good. Earthly life was good. Their inner desires have become fattened, but it's for the day of slaughter. And just like fattened calves were, their day of slaughter would be AD 70 judgment. By saying you have nourished your hearts in the day of slaughter, James now keys this, he draws this back into the imagery of Jeremiah 12, verse 3, where Jeremiah writes, he says, but thou, O Jehovah, knowest me. Thou seest me and triest my heart toward thee. Pull them out like sheep for the slaughter and prepare them for the day of slaughter. Now, this prophet was railing against those who were like fatted calves, or fatted sheep back in his day. The third sin we see in verse 6 involves physical violence. You have condemned, you have killed the righteous one. Now, the word killed here points to judicial murder. Those who have wealth also have political power and can get what they want. So these rich men have hoarded wealth, they've cheated their workers, they've lived a life of self-indulgence, they've oppressed Jewish believers. Now James accuses them of condemning and murdering innocent men. But the righteous did not resist persecution. They were unable to oppose the power and influence of the rich. Jewish believers followed the law of non-resistance in keeping with Matthew 5, 39, which says, resist not him that is evil. Now, for these three sins, the rich are going to be under a particularly heavy judgment. Now, where it says in this verse here, it says the righteous one, where it says you have killed the righteous one. The Greek here literally reads the righteous one, and it could be taken in one of two ways here. If the word righteous is used of a singular person, then it refers to the Messiah. Messiah is called the righteous one in Acts 3:14 and Acts 7:52, Acts 22:14. He's also called the righteous one in 1 John 2 verse 1 and 1 John 3:7. Now, if this is the intent, the author is accusing the rich, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees here of murdering the Messiah. However, the word righteous could also refer to the righteous as a class or as a group of people. And in this case, it's not referring to Jesus, but it's more likely to the Jewish believers, in keeping with the context that we're currently in here of what James is saying. So I noticed in several commentaries, some spoke about it being referring to Messiah, and others said no, it can't be. It has to be the people. So it's more in context here with the people. Now, what kind of a life to lead until the Lord returns? Well, we find this in chapter 5, verses 7 to 20. In verses 7 to 11, we have to exercise patient endurance. Now, this is simply an expanding of what we saw back in chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. The topic of patience is going to develop as the primary theme in this section of 7 to 11, because it occurs 6 times. It's originating from 2 different Greek words. We have in verse 7, we have it twice. In verse 8, 10, and 11. In verse 8 and 10, we have it once. Verse 11, we have it twice. So 6 times all up in these 5 verses. Now we have the exhortation to patience in verses 7 to 8. Be patient, therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient over it, until it receives the early and latter rain. Be ye also patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. So verses 7 to 8 exhorts patience. First part of verse 7 contains the actual appeal to be patient until the Lord returns. And again, the word therefore builds on earlier descriptions about unbelievers and their persecutions in verse 1 to 6. So he says, in light of the persecutions that you're suffering, be patient. Be patient, therefore. And the Greek word for patient here is to be long-tempered, as opposed to being short-tempered, and it refers to the attitude of self-restraint. They need to refrain from any hasty retaliation in the face of provocation. Count to 10 before you say or do anything. So it's it's patience when we're putting up with difficult people. Exercise patience as you wait for and look for the coming of the Lord. Now, this is not the same word used back in verses 3 to 4 in chapter 1. Chapter 1, verse 3 to 4 and verse 13. Nor is it the same word we're going to see in 5:11. Back in chapter 1, verse 3, it says, knowing that the proving of your faith works patience, let patience have its perfect work. It's not the same word here. Believers here are to be patient, to be long-tempered until the coming of the Lord. And this is until the parousia, the second coming, which will terminate their persecution, oppression, and injustice. Everything will be fixed when Jesus returns at the second coming. Now, James calls on them and us to adopt an attitude of resignation in the face of suffering, along with the confident expectation of a day when the fortunes of this life would be reversed. Now, while liberal scholars here have claimed that James was simply warning and expecting the return of the Lord soon, his statement need not to be interpreted as if the second coming would necessarily occur in his lifetime. But what this does demonstrate is that James had a strong sense of imminence, meaning that the peruser may come in his lifetime, not that it had to come. Now, when he states until the coming of the Lord, it's emphasizing here that Jesus is God, emphasizing Jesus as God, as Jehovah, the Lord God. Second part of verse 7, James provides the example of patience. He says, behold the husbandman, and the word behold again, special attention here. The husbandman here is the tenant farmer. He's not the day laborer. This is a guy who has a plot of dirt and he's working it. And what does he do? Well, the tenant farmer, he waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient over it. So the tenant farmer plants and he sows the seed, and then if you plant and sow seed, well, you then wait for the crop to spring up. This is a natural illustration of patience, not paints, patience. But this farmer is dependent upon external forces, forces outside of his control, for instance. Well, he's dependent upon the rain for a start. The rain will ensure crop growth. No rain, no crop growth. So he's dependent upon rain. So being patient, seeds in the ground, he has this attitude of expectancy in spite of uncertainty, such as bad weather or pestilence, for instance. So this farmer knows what eventually comes forth will be precious. Why? Because physical life depends upon this grain coming forth, this grain springing to life. The Greek word order here virtually says, be you patient, also you. Farmer, be you patient. James is saying to the Jewish believers, be you patient, also you guys. So in the same way, the spiritual harvest also is dependent upon God's intervention. So the point of this verse here is for believers to maintain an attitude of expectancy until it receive the early and latter rain. Now, early and latter rain once again reveals this is the Israeli content or origin of this letter. The timing of the rain has a direct effect on the yield of the crop. All the farmer can do is stand back and trust in the providential coming of the rain. Early rain arrives around October, November. Latter rain comes March, April. Main rainfall comes in between this period. Now, James, having given this illustration, he makes the application in verse 8. First of all, he says, be you also patient. Like the farmer is patient, you need to be patient also. Be you patient, also you. Second, establish your hearts. And the word means to strengthen something. It will stand firm and unmovable. Believers are to develop an inner stability rather than to be shaken by their persecution. Don't stress about it. Just to have the right attitude when it comes. The coming of the Lord is at hand. That becomes the basis for this inner stability, the blessed hope of the parousia. The perfect tense of at hand indicates that this event is near, but has not yet arrived. So it's coming. Now, if the parousia is at hand, why have 2,000 years? Why have 2,000 years passed without its occurrence? Well, at hand denotes imminence, and it carries an attitude of expectancy. And here it's a reference to the rapture, an event that really can happen at any moment in time, in contrast to the second coming, which requires a number of events to precede it. So the rapture is what we are waiting for with expectancy. So we're we can develop this inner stability because we know that at any time the rapture can take place. And so in verse 9, James applies the issue of patience and the conduct of the tongue. Murmur not, brethren, one against another. And not to murmur, not to grumble, not to complain against fellow believers. And the Greek word means to sigh or to groan. The command is therefore, grumble not, because that unacceptable action exhibits the entire feeling of dissatisfaction, resulting in outward criticism and fault finding. Remember, we just covered that last session. Again, we see here brothers, which means they're fellow believers. And the reason is that you be not judged, not to be judged by the son who is already standing before the doors. So this type of attitude is a violation of the command of Jesus in Matthew 7, verse 1 and Luke 6, verse 37. Now, a further reason here is not to murmur against one another is because, behold, the judge stands before the doors. The word behold, again, special attention here. Now, in this case, Jesus is the judge before whom they will stand at the judgment seat of Christ, which we find in 2 Corinthians 5:10. Now, this judge stands before the doors. Again, it's emphasizing imminence. It can happen at any time, this. Now, it doesn't mean soon, but just that it can happen at any time. You know, the rapture, 2,000 years have been waiting. Now, as it was true for James, it's still true for us today. And see here, it says doors. Well, it's plural. Why? Because it pictures the double doors of entry into the judgment hall in the temple compound. So the guilty are about to go through these double entry doors into the judgment hall. And then in verses 10 to 11, we have the example of patient endurance. This is verse 10. Take, brethren, for an example of suffering and of patience, the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we call them blessed that endured. You have heard of the patience of Job and have seen the end of the Lord, how that the Lord is full of pity and merciful. So in verses 10 to 11, James now provides two examples of patient endurance. First up, in verse 10 and the first part of 11, is the example of the prophets. The example of the suffering and of patience. Now, by addressing his audience as brethren, again, he's emphasizing that his readers are Jewish believers who are now obliged to reflect upon the Old Testament. You know, they should know it. And the word example in the Greek text is in the emphatic position. So the Greek word for suffering appears only here in this verse, and it covers what it does here. It covers the concept of endurance under hardship. Toughen up. So patiently, these sufferings were endured by the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. They endured it patiently. And because they endured, we call them blessed. Again, James uses the word behold, gathering the attention of his readers to this example of patient endurance. We call them blessed, using a form of the word found only here, nowhere else. We see another form of it in Matthew chapter 5, verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And this is depicting as common practice the admiration of those who exercise patient endurance. When he states that endured, James refers to the patient endurance of, going back to chapter 1, verses 3 to 11, the testing of your faith. So these prophets were regularly characterized by patient endurance. And in the second part of verse 11, Job is the new example. You have heard of the patience of Job. Now, this is the only mention of Job in the New Testament. Job 5:13 is quoted in 1 Corinthians 3:18, but he's not specifically named in that Corinthian passage. The word patience here emphasizes patient endurance in this verse, but it's not the same as what we just saw in verse 10. Here it emphasizes patient endurance. In verse 11, the word patience means not complaining. While Job certainly did complain, the point is Job did remain loyal to God and did not complain to the point of apostasy. He complained about a situation, but he did not lose faith in God. Remain loyal to him. And have seen the end of the Lord. So when James writes and have seen, he implies the readers know exactly the story's ending. So in the outcome, Job's patience was vindicated, as we see in the phrase, the end of the Lord. And the Greek word for end means goal, the goal. So Job's patience was the goal of Job's suffering. He suffered so that he could develop patience, and patience was what he developed. Now, eventually, Job reached the end of his sufferings, or the goal of his sufferings. But God's goal for Job's sufferings has been revealed, and that is to deflect Satan's slander and to vindicate Job's faith. So this demonstrates how the Lord is full of pity and merciful. And the Greek word for pity appears only here. It's an adjective, it's a compound adjective, and it means to be very, very compassionate. And the word used for merciful here appears only here and in Luke 6, verse 36. So what we see is, the merciful here is the act. It's the act by which God does something. So what we see here is that endurance under trial would be rewarded by a compassionate and a merciful Lord. And that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.